wanted to welcome you and thank you for coming to tonight's presentation. I'm Meryl Sopner. I'm the board chair of the Windham World Affairs Council, and we're very pleased to present tonight's talk on climate diplomacy with Elliot Diringer. Our organization was founded in 1961 as a forum for discussing world affairs. We're the smallest of the National World Affairs Councils of America, an independent, nonpartisan organization dedicated to engaging the public and leading global voices to better understand the world, America's international role, and the policy choices that impact our daily lives and our future. We're committed to making all of our speaker events free and accessible to all, and we rely on the support of the public, you, through membership dues and donations that we receive at these events. If this is your first event or you've been attending many of our events, we encourage you to join as a member and get to know our group of international thinkers. Student memberships are free, and until the end of the month, individuals are $35 a year, family memberships are $50 a year, and life memberships are $500. You can join online or our website, or they'd be happy to help you at the table in the back, or come talk to one of the board members, and if the board members could just raise their hands. We have Tamara and Claire and Scott. And as a member, you'll be invited to our members and friends salons. They're informal discussions among members of our community on international topics held at 118 Elliot. And your membership also supports Peace Jam, our youth outreach and mentoring program at Brattleboro Union High School, which was launched a few years ago with member Jody Williams, herself a Nobel Peace Laureate. And I want to tell you about one other event we're having this month. On June 23rd, David Bollier, author of the book Think Like a Commoner, will be explaining the concept of the commons to govern public goods as an alternative to commercialization, such as through public lands, digital commons, and traditional practices. This talk came out of a film screening we held in March on the Invisible Doctrine, in which the commons was offered up as an alternative to the bleak picture created by rampant neoliberalism. Bollier will discuss the concept through international examples and join us at the Center Congregational Church, which itself was once part of Brattleboro's Commons, on Monday, June 23rd at 6:30 p.m. And so on the subject of governing public goods, the earth and the climate being the most important public good, I now turn it over to Chuck Collins to introduce our speaker.
We are going to use the mic just because we're recording and also have people listening from home. Anyway, I'm Chuck Collins. I live here in Guilford. I'm a big fan of the Windham World Affairs Council, and it's kind of exciting that we're having a World Affairs Council event here at the satellite location in Guilford. Many of us from Guilford go to Brattleboro for these wonderful programs, so I'm curious how many of you have never been to this hall here, the community center here. Okay, well, special welcome to what used to be called the Broad Brook Grange Hall, Grange 151, but it's now, the Grange continues to operate and meet here, but it's now the Broad Brook Community Center, and we did a big effort to save this building and elevate it and put an elevator in and build up the structure, and the Grange continues to operate. In fact, this Sunday, if you've never been to a Father's Day brunch, this is the place to be. So come on back. So, and I'm happy because I'm getting to introduce a new neighbor, a new resident of Guilford. Many of you I recognize from people who've been thinking about climate change, climate disruption, the moment we're in. It's a particularly scary moment as we're almost on a daily basis seeing the current administration moving radically away from any kind of efforts to address climate change, which makes it all the more important what else is happening in the world, what's happening in the private sector, what's happening in the community sector, what's happening with other countries. And we are very lucky that Elliot Diringer is here. Elliot Diringer is here now in Guilford. But let me just say a little bit about Elliot. Elliot has worked for over 30 years as a journalist, as a policy person. He's been to most of the COP meetings starting in 1992 with the Earth Summit. Is that right? You were at the... So, and in fact, recently, just in the last month, returned to Brazil to be part of some of these international conversations. His most recent assignment, a year ago, he was the assistant to John Kerry, who at the State Department, in terms of John Kerry's role implementing U.S. climate negotiations, climate relations. So he is probably the best person we could call on to kind of give us the moment we're in, sort of lift up and explain sort of some of what's happening. So I should say he lives now on Bonneville Road. Some of you might even come on Bonneville Road to come here with his wife Lauren, who's an artist and painter, Lauren Rader. So we're thrilled to have them as neighbors, and we kind of, pressed him into service, taking advantage of his newness in the community. But let's give Elliot a welcome, a Guilford welcome, and a welcome to the World Affairs Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck, and thank you, Meryl, and thanks to the Windham World Affairs Council for organizing the event. The mission of the World Affairs Council is really very close to my heart, as hopefully comes across when I talk about some of the work I've done. Thanks also to the folks at BBCC for hosting. It's really wonderful to give this talk here, and I don't know that I've ever had a better backdrop, to be honest. I especially would like to thank Susan Healy. Susan, where are you? Did Susan step out? Okay. Susan of the Windham World Affairs Council. I first met Susan nearly 2 years ago, paddling out on South Pond. My wife Lauren and I were on one of our early scouting trips, looking for a place to settle here in the Brattleboro area, and Susan made a very strong case that it was a good idea. She very quickly followed up and said, and we have to have you come talk to the World Affairs Council. So it's taken nearly 2 years, but I'm glad I'm here. And then, Susan also very quickly introduced us to some of the other folks in town, including Chuck. So for me, this was all a very nice kind of preview of the welcoming spirit that we've really found here, including all of you turning out tonight. So thank you for being here. We've recently moved, and the process of packing and preparing for a move is really a good opportunity to kind of reflect back and retrace your steps, and as you dig through old boxes of stuff that have accumulated over the years. In the course of that, I was reminded of my long engagement on environmental issues, going back at least as far as my days in the Boy Scouts. I found my forestry merit badge and conservation of natural resources. So these are concepts that I was exposed to early on, and my career has given me an opportunity to engage in these issues from multiple perspectives. As Chuck said, I was a journalist for a time. That was how I first encountered climate change and the world of international negotiations. I spent some time in government, first in the Clinton White House, somewhat unexpectedly, and then most recently supporting John Kerry at the State Department. But most of the last 25 years ago, I actually spent at a small climate think tank in Washington, D.C. And a lot of what I did there, I've sometimes referred to as NGO diplomacy, working with governments to help advance the international climate effort. Retracing all those steps kind of gave me a somewhat new perspective on the journey that's brought me here to Guilford, actually, because part of what drew me here, part of what drew me to Vermont is the land. Once I got here, I was drawn by the people as well. And a lot of my work over the years has really focused on the intersection, the relationship between people and the land. And I feel like now I have an opportunity to move from focusing on those things somewhat abstractly to being in a place where that relationship between the people and the land is really so much more direct and intimate. And the talk right here last night by Roger Albee, former agriculture secretary for the state, really hit home to me on that score. So very glad to be here. Let me go straight to the question posed by the title of the talk, which is, are we making any progress, right? Climate diplomacy, are we making any progress? And, I'm curious, I'd like to ask a show of hands, how many of you think we are making progress? Okay, well, I'm glad to see we've got some optimism in the room. That's great. And I want to address the question kind of at two levels. First, in terms of the diplomatic level, are we making progress in terms of establishing stronger understandings among the countries of the world on what needs to be done? And then also at the existential level, if you will. Are we, in fact, bending the trajectory, reducing emissions, limiting temperature increase, and really, what it's about is reducing the future risks. And I think it's important to separate those two in part because the international response is really just one piece of what delivers the progress at the existential level. This is a problem that needs to be tackled at every level, and I think it's important to understand, and I think we've come to understand over the years, what the international component of that can and cannot deliver. So I would say my short answer to the question is yes, but. I think at both levels, the diplomatic and the existential, we are making progress. I would say that in diplomatic terms, the Paris Agreement, achieved not quite 10 years ago, is a pretty remarkable achievement, particularly in an increasingly fractious and fragmented world. I think it's important, if not profound, in a couple of ways. The core purpose of international agreements, these are agreements among national governments, and the purpose is to strengthen and clarify understandings amongst them. And I think the Paris Agreement does a good job of establishing some norms for countries to live by, and providing some semblance of accountability among governments, and strengthening the collective sense of purpose. I think there's a second way that Paris has proven pretty effective, I think it's very unique, in fact, among international agreements, that its effect goes well beyond shaping the behavior of national governments. It has what I sometimes refer to as a signaling effect. It has sent a signal throughout societies. And the notion that we need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees or that we need to achieve net zero emissions has become internalized. And it has helped drive action by state governments and local governments. It really has shifted thinking within the corporate world as well. So the internalization of the urgency and values represented by the Paris Agreement, I think, has been another important effect. It's been nearly 10 years, as I said, but still, I would say it's probably still too early to judge whether Paris will be a success. But I would say that in and of itself, it won't, and it can't possibly solve the climate problem. In terms of the existential level, are we making progress at the existential level? The most obvious barometer of that is temperature increase. And before Paris, the projections were that global temperature would rise well more than 3, possibly even into 4 degrees Celsius by 2100. The latest estimates from the International Energy Agency, the IEA, say that with policies now in place, we're on track to 2.4 degrees of warming. So I think that is a significant improvement, obviously still not where we need to be, but an important reduction of future risk. Another barometer is investment in clean energy technologies and deployment. And at this point, that's approaching $2 trillion a year, which is nearly double the amount being invested annually in coal and oil and gas development. So to me, that's a fairly astounding shift in terms of how we are prioritizing investment in energy sources. At the same time, as of last year, we probably have already hit 1.5 degrees of warming, and fossil fuel use continues at record levels. We've brought on massive amounts of renewable energy, but for the most part, or to some degree, that's been additive. It's not replaced fossil fuels, it's enabled us to use more energy. So emissions are going up more slowly than they otherwise would, but they're still going up. And the window, I would say, for the kind of action we need to avoid truly catastrophic warming, it's still open, but it is very quickly narrowing. I want to outline what I view as some of the fundamental characteristics of the climate challenge that make it so especially difficult to really come to terms with. The first is that climate change is truly global in nature. It is a quintessential global challenge. A molecule of CO2, whether it's emitted here or in Beijing or in South Africa or wherever, to the atmosphere, it has the same impact. So wherever we are, the emissions that we're contributing are affecting the entire globe. And we are all affected by climate change. But what that means is that, Merrill referred to the commons. This is a classic tragedy of the commons dilemma, because it's easy to say to yourself, well, why should I bother reducing my emissions if the people over there aren't? Because we're still going to get warming. So there's this disincentive for anyone to act first. So that's been a huge impediment to getting rolling on this issue. Another challenge is the long time horizon we're dealing with here. Effectively, if we're going to do what we need to do, we need to invest now, we need to pay now for avoiding risks that are well down the road. Some societies are better at that than others, but I wouldn't say that we have a great track record of being willing to fork out now for benefits really to future generations. Another fundamental characteristic of this issue you really need to understand are the deep inequities embedded in it. The countries, the people that have contributed least to the problem, because they emit very little, are the ones who stand to suffer the worst impacts. And they're also the ones who have the least capacity actually to deal with those impacts. So it's just inherently deep inequities here, and you have to appreciate that for people in those parts of the world, this is layered on top of deeper structural inequities in the global order that have been there for centuries. Tough issues to be worked through there. Finally, this is a fundamentally economic issue. It affects every sector of the economy, certainly any sector that uses energy, and agriculture is hugely affected, both as a source of emissions, but also in terms of coping with the impacts. I would say that the economic challenges are greatest in the developing world, where the bulk of future emissions are likely to come from, and where governments and economies are struggling to meet everyday needs now. And if they are going to take on the climate challenge, it's only fair that they be able to do it in a way that preserves and even helps serve their legitimate aspirations for a higher standard of living. So given some really tough challenges there. What's the theory of change, right? How do we deal with this? I think fundamentally we need to redirect economic activity. I think of addressing climate change as requiring directed change on a scale that we have never ever tried before. I mean, the only analogies I can think of are the wartime mobilization, but that was temporary mobilization to address a very clear and immediate and present danger. A very different sort of challenge that we face with climate change. But that's what we need to do. We've obviously had massive economic and technological and energy transformations in the past, but those have proceeded more organically. Here, we don't have time for that. We got to make it happen. You can't count on the market to do that. I think we will see that. But at the same time, I think there is a lot actually that you do need to count on the market for, because it's great at stimulating innovation and mobilizing capital, but it needs direction. So I wouldn't argue for a dismantling of capitalism. I think instead what we need to do is redirect and harness capitalism towards solving this problem. The only way I know to do that is with public policy. Whether it's mandates or incentives or some mix of the two. And obviously to get policy, you require some political will and a political system able to translate that political will into action. To get the political will, you need some consciousness, and I think we've actually come a long way in the last 25 years or so in terms of raising consciousness. On this issue, we need to find a way to align national and global interests. And part of that is having confidence that others are doing their fair share. Because if we know that they're doing their fair share, then we're more willing to be ambitious. And so that's where the diplomacy comes in, that's where the international agreements come in. Let me offer you a highly encapsulated kind of history of the international effort. Chuck mentioned the Rio Earth Summit in '92. That was the launch of the climate effort with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. At the time, it was the largest gathering of heads of state ever. I was there as a reporter covering the event for the San Francisco Chronicle. The U.S. was represented by President Bush, the first President Bush. We signed the Framework Convention, ratified unanimously by the Senate. And that is the foundation for the international effort. It did many things, of course, but I just want to highlight a couple. It set a goal, right? A qualitative goal, which was avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. So that was how we defined it back in '92, avoiding dangerous interference. It also established a really important principle meant to address the whole fairness and equity issue, which is called Common but Differentiated Responsibilities, CBDR. So it's a recognition that we all have some responsibility here, but that given the inequities, those responsibilities are very differentiated. Some bear more responsibility than others, and at that point, that meant a very stark division between developed and developing countries. Developed countries had obligations, and developing countries had very few. It was quickly apparent that wasn't enough, right? That wasn't going to get the job done. So a new round of negotiations was launched, which led in 1997 to the Kyoto Protocol. And I had planned on covering that conference as a reporter as well, but through an unexpected set of circumstances, actually wound up going as part of the U.S. delegation and supporting Al Gore. The U.S. was very deeply involved in shaping the Kyoto Protocol. There were pieces of that were designed entirely in the U.S. And obviously was viewed as a major accomplishment by Vice President Gore. One thing it did, again with this strict bifurcation between developed and developing, it said that developed countries would have binding emissions targets, and those were negotiated. No one really ever said how those would be enforced, but they were binding, right? The Clinton administration never actually forwarded the Kyoto Protocol to the Senate for ratification. And then the second President Bush came in and very quickly made clear that the U.S. would never join the Kyoto Protocol. So that kicked off a pretty extended period, I would say, of drift within the international effort. Drift and occasional dramas, like the collapse of the negotiations in Copenhagen in 2009. But people maintained the pressure, and then finally another round of negotiation was kicked off that led to the Paris Agreement in 2015. At that time, in my role at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, a lot of what I had been doing is organizing informal talks among lead negotiators from key countries. And at the urging of some of them, we organized a series of closed-door discussions among lead negotiators in the 2 years preceding the Paris negotiations, where they were able to meet informally and really kind of hash through a lot of the core issues. And we wound up with a short, but I think very influential report coming out of those discussions, which laid out some of the essential elements of what became the Paris Agreement. Paris, I think, absorbed a lot of the learnings of the 20 years of failed diplomacy that preceded it. It had a more realistic vision of what can be delivered at the international level. We talk about it as a hybrid agreement. It had some top-down elements, like a set of goals, including the temperature goal of well below 2 or 1.5. And it established the commitments that it established are procedural in nature, in the sense that to be a party, you commit to making a nationally determined contribution. That's your target. And you commit to reporting on your emissions and what you're doing to implement your nationally determined contribution. But the content of that NDC, as it's called, is entirely for you to decide. So that's the bottom-up element. So you have some glue holding the thing together, but the level of ambition delivered by countries is entirely up to them. I think of it as kind of a systematized peer pressure framework, where you say to countries, okay, tell us what you're going to do, that's your NDC, and show us what you're doing through the mandated reporting on your actions and your emissions. That level of transparency provides some degree of accountability, and if countries are doing a good job, it helps provide that confidence that helps build the political will to do more. And there's also this ambition cycle. Every 5 years, there is a global stocktake, which it takes, assesses effort globally, collectively. How are we doing collectively? And the first one of those was a couple of years ago. And then on the basis of the findings there, countries come in with their next round of NDCs. So it's, tell us what you're going to do, show us what you're doing. Now tell us what you're going to do next. We are, at this point facing a major test, which is that next round of NDCs which countries have to come in with. Only a handful have so far. They're due this year. When we see what China's prepared to do, and the EU, will have a better sense of how on track we might be. You do have to wonder about the effect of the actions being taken by this administration, both in terms of the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and the dismantling of a lot of the policies we put into place domestically to deliver on our own obligations. The U.S. has been in and out of the global effort over the years, and yet it has remained intact. I think it's important to distinguish between U.S. emissions, what kind of impact is all of this going to have in terms of our emissions and their contribution to global emissions, and U.S. leadership. So in terms of emissions, the U.S. has a shrinking share of global emissions. We're still a major emitter, but far surpassed by China. And the growth in emissions is really happening in the developing world at this point. So yes, what the U.S. does in terms of emissions matters, but it matters less than it used to. But the scaling back of U.S. leadership, I think, can have an important effect in terms of weakening the ambition of other countries. Now, you know, we haven't seen other countries saying they're going to pull out of the Paris Agreement, and that's good. But it's easy to stay in the Paris Agreement, not expose yourself to the kind of political blowback you might get if you withdrew, but not be terribly ambitious. So it's important to see the level of ambition they come in with this year. I've talked about the climate effort more or less in isolation, and you know, it's important to see it in this moment in a broader geopolitical context, because what we're seeing globally is a fragmentation of efforts, a weakening of multilateralism. A lot of this is driven by concerns around economic security and national security, and just positioning for power in the global order. I want to, you know, look at the Inflation Reduction Act of the Biden administration as something of an illustration here. What the IRA does, I mean, it provides massive subsidies for clean energy and other technologies that help address climate change. And it does that by tying climate action to jobs and to strategic competitiveness. It was really designed to rebuild domestic industry and to secure supply chains for U.S. industry. And you know, it does that through these massive subsidies, which to other countries appear to be unfair trade practices. So the political formulation that enabled us to enact ambitious climate action actually created tensions with other countries around, because frankly they are not in keeping with the rules of the World Trade Organization. I think that the competition that we're seeing is most obvious in the case of critical minerals, and you know, the kind of interest you've seen from President Trump in places like Greenland and Ukraine is about critical minerals. So I think to some degree the new tensions we're seeing are a natural outgrowth of increased climate ambition. We're mobilizing resources to tackle this issue, and we're doing it in ways that are creating new types of tensions between countries. And we're at risk of really shifting from a mode of cooperation to a mode of competition. So I think we may well be at an inflection point. We've made some progress, we've built some momentum, but we do face significant headwinds. It is obviously too late to avoid some of the impacts of climate change we're experiencing now. We're going to experience worse in the future. We need to prepare for that. But there is still a lot we can do and need to do to minimize those future impacts. And we need to do it in a way that addresses the sustainability and just needs of the developing world. We need to help them develop in ways that minimize future climate risks, but also meet their immediate and near-term economic and development needs. And I think, frankly, if the solutions are not just, they're not going to be ambitious either. So let me close just by sharing some borrowed wisdom. People sometimes ask me how I keep working on an issue that appears to be such a formidable challenge with little evidence of progress. And you know, I view this as a long game, and I think it's important that we recognize and value and take comfort in the incremental gains when we achieve them. And I often find myself reminded of a saying attributed to a sage rabbi nearly 2,000 years ago, Rabbi Tarfon, and I've noticed that Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, has begun citing the same quotation. The quote is that you are not required to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. So I think that helps me anyway cope with a challenge like this. So I think, you know, we each do what we can, and we have to have confidence that in whatever small way that can contribute to making progress. So look forward to the discussion, and thanks again to our host.
So we'll take questions.
Yeah, has there been any discussion at any level internationally about the establishment of something, maybe on the order of the Civilian Conservation Corps, you know, an Earth force, as opposed to a space force,
Yeah.
a mobilization?
Great idea.
So I'm thinking of whether I've ever heard of that kind of suggestion at the international level, and I'm not coming up with it. But that's it's a great idea, and certainly something that should be done at the domestic level. And that the Biden administration, I'm trying to remember the name of they basically did create something of that nature to help mobilize action here in the United States.
There's a miniature version of it, kind of in the Army Corps of Engineers, you know, who do that kind of work, but not on a scale that's appropriate for the need.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the nub there is scale. So, you know, I've talked about the progress we've made, and we really do need to scale it up. Yeah, but like I said earlier, you know, this is something that has to be tackled at every level and in so many different ways. Really, there's no end of ways where we can. And you know, one of the things that I also take comfort in is I am exposed all the time to people tackling this issue in different ways, whether it is scientists documenting the change and understanding how temperature rise is going to play out, whether it's analysts doing economic modeling to try to figure out what the best policy measures are to deliver the action we need as cost efficiently as possible. Whether it's Chuck mentioned I was back in Rio a few weeks ago. In my work now, I am leading a dialogue, an international dialogue, focused on these tensions between climate and trade. And I was in Rio to lead a workshop of people from government, from the private sector, from the expert community. And you know, spending 2 days in a room with people from different spheres, different countries, seeing the level of commitment they are all bringing to a challenge like this. And you know, some of the most encouraging stuff, frankly, was what you hear from companies who recognize the reality of the challenge, are trying to find opportunity, ways to profitably address the challenge, and are frustrated by the lack of policy support they're experiencing. But these are people who are taking these issues very seriously, and there are a lot of smart minds coming up with ideas, and you know, we just need to scale up the capital behind some of those ideas. Oh, okay. Yeah, Lisa.
I don't follow the climate talks that closely, but I think I was really impressed by the last round and the participation, particularly of the Saudis, and the participation, and it looked like hijacking of the negotiations by the fossil fuel companies. So I'm really, and at the same time, the promotion of quickly scaled up, which is really not possible, nuclear, being promoted by the Saudis. I find this all very perplexing and troubling. Can you comment on that?
So obviously, this is a UN-based system and agreement, and the idea is to achieve participation by as many countries as possible. So the Saudis have been deeply engaged in these negotiations for a long time. If you go back 2 COPs ago, right, the big item that got attention there was the agreement on the phrase transition away from fossil fuels. It can seem somewhat remarkable that getting agreement on that concept is viewed as such an accomplishment. But given the interests of countries like the Saudis, I think it was an accomplishment. And at this point, the negotiations themselves have kind of transitioned from negotiation to implementation mode. A lot of the big issues have been negotiated. The one huge exception to that is finance, right? The developed countries have done a really poor job in terms of mobilizing resources to help the developing world, and that issue is only going to become more acute. But a lot of what comes out of the COPs at this point and gets the attention are more or less political statements. So the idea of transitioning away from fossil fuels, completely, unenforceable. No one country said, or maybe there might have been some that said it, but there's no obligation on the part of countries to truly transition away from fossil fuels. But establishing that as a norm was important. So last year, in part, what you were seeing was the Saudis and others coming back on that, right? There's been a lot of debate about whether fossil fuel companies should be allowed to attend the negotiations. I'm of the view that, frankly, we need everybody at the table. And if we begin excluding people, it becomes very tricky to know exactly where to draw that line. I think you need, there's a huge NGO presence at these talks, and they're the ones who need to keep the pressure on the governments to do the right thing. As far as nuclear, at this point, I don't think we can afford to. I think we need to use all the tools in the toolbox. I'm not a nuclear expert, but there are people who I greatly respect who feel as if the newer generations of nuclear technology are got to be part of the solution here. And there was support in the IRA for that as well. So I think we do our best to learn from experiences, including the risks we've exposed ourselves to through technologies like nuclear, and if there are better ways to do it. I mean, there is no, at the moment, there is no better zero carbon baseload source of electricity than nuclear power. And you want to scale up renewables as much as you can, but until we get battery storage solved, renewables are intermittent. You can't count on them all the time. We're not going to get to a true, fully renewable electricity supply anytime soon. So I think that I think what I've seen over the years in terms of what it takes to get agreement among parties is a willingness to re-examine some things that we maybe have believed strongly, and in light of present circumstances, evaluate whether we need to be thinking differently about them. And I'd put nuclear in that category. Jim. I'm so proud of myself that the first 2 people I've called on, I've actually known your names.
You mentioned earlier that people, it's sort of inherent in us to see who's not wanting to go out and be the first one, to see, is somebody, my neighbor going to do it? And, the U.S. has got a very checkered history at this point in its leadership on this environmental issue. And are there countries or regions in the world who are taking this more seriously than America is? And if so, who are they? And that includes both the developed world and the developing world, because, you know, as you mentioned, there's a stark difference between the two.
Yeah, well, I say among developed countries, the EU, the European Union, has long been the leader. And for lots of different reasons has been willing to invest more heavily in driving action, and has succeeded. Among other developed countries, you know, I would say some of the smaller ones, New Zealand, Switzerland, Norway, but you know, there aren't that, I mean, the other large developed countries, Japan, Canada, I'd say have had a much more mixed record. Among developing countries, I mean, the issues here are really tough, and coal is an enormous source of the problem here. Coal is cheap, it's abundant. You know, there are many large developing countries, China, India, Indonesia, deeply dependent on coal. And until you can make alternatives affordable to them, you know, they're going to keep using coal. So I think there are also, you know, a number of smaller developing countries, some of the Latin countries, Costa Rica, Colombia, that, you know, have been more forward-leaning on the issue. But unfortunately, you know, by virtue of being smaller, they have less of an impact. You know, starting out in 1992, like I said, there was this stark division in the global regime between developed and developing. And for a long time, developing countries negotiated as a single bloc, the G77, the group of 77 plus China, and you know, they would just adopt the same positions. But you know, when you unpack it, within that grouping, you have such an incredible range of interests. You have Saudi Arabia, right, which all it wants to do is maintain itself as a petrostate, and you have the world's poorest countries who are suffering as a consequence. So over time, you have the small island states who fear that their very existence is at risk here. So over time, you've seen more differentiation among those countries, which I think has helped open things up to progress. But you can't underestimate China's influence in all this. At this point, China is by far the biggest emitter. It also dominates the renewable energy supply globally. It has a lock on critical minerals globally. And other developing countries are very fearful of standing up to China. So I think if there's one place where our future with respect to climate change is going to be decided, it's Beijing. Yeah.
Just related to that, it's actually leading into the question I was going to ask. So there's been a lot made of China just building huge numbers of coal factories, you know, in the last few years, and then continuing, but then still maintaining that they're going to, you know, decrease emissions, and that they're actually ahead of schedule for decreasing emissions. And the other aspect of that is them building coal factories for other countries too. So, you know, I've just wondered if, you know, is there a hope that they're building these coal things in China just sort of as a backup, and they're not going to use them as much, or?
You have to think that because they're building them at such a scale that it's hard to imagine that they actually will fully use them, but they're keeping all options on the table. You know, they are far ahead of anybody in terms of renewable energy deployment, but again, that's additive, not replacing the coal yet. And as far as them, you know, overachieving their goals, they set very weak goals. They set goals they know they can meet or exceed. So when they say it, it's true, but you have to understand that they can do a lot better. They have committed at this point to stop financing coal plants in other countries. So hopefully they stick to that. But they got lots of other things that they can sell to other countries and finance in other countries, and they've done a pretty good job of locking up the critical mineral supplies in lots of other countries. I see a question way in the back there.
At least they're
I have a
denying
question,
that.
kind of on the idea of China. I was kind of disappointed when I saw how China really jumped ahead with the electric car, right? They came up with like these really amazing cool models, totally affordable, yeah, it's subsidized by the government. But if we're looking like, on a world level, Europe put like huge subsidies on those cars so that they weren't competing with the European car manufacturers, and they're not even allowed here in the United States. So to me, that seemed like a big disappointment. Like we're having these regional wars over who's in control of resources, and why is it fair for a government to subsidize a car that becomes affordable? It's going to help everybody to have less emissions, and then everyone's fighting against it and not letting those cars out. So it's complicated, but I was wondering if you had anything to say about that.
It is complicated, and the tariffs on Chinese imports didn't start with President Trump. We were increasing tariffs on Chinese clean technology under President Biden as well. And that was meant as a protectionist move because we would rather that those technologies be made here. So we were providing subsidies to grow those technologies in the U.S., putting tariffs on the Chinese imports to protect those nascent industries. And you could argue that all of that drives up the cost of deploying the technologies we need. You're right, it's complicated. But I view the IRA as, the organization I worked for many years, our overriding mission was really to enact comprehensive climate policy in the United States. For us, that meant some form of market-based policy, putting a price on carbon, whether that was through cap and trade or a carbon tax. But we also believed that it needed to be done on a bipartisan basis so that it would endure. So we never got that. What we got instead was the IRA, which is a very different form of policy, hugely ambitious, but a very different approach, enacted entirely on a partisan basis. So we're at a moment now, actually, where we will see if it can endure, because the big, beautiful bill that came out of the House basically dismantles it. And it'll be up to the Senate to see whether we are able to retain any of that. So, figuring out the formula, the policy formula that can make it through the political system is something people have been working on for a long time, and I'd love to see the IRA, at least most of it, remain intact, but we'll know soon. I'm going to go.
Are there any ideas out there about, so you buy food at a grocery store, you know what's in it. You buy something that you're touching on a daily basis, you don't necessarily know what it's made of. Is there any talk about breaking down the social math of what the emissions are in any given thing that we buy, like a nutritional label?
Yes, and you'll see, when you book airline tickets, they tell you the emissions associated with them. You can see some things on Amazon now that, claim to have some certification as being lower carbon. And it's a great idea. I mean, it's basically, providing information to people so they can make the right choices. In the case of emissions, it's enormously complicated, particularly when you are talking about finished products like automobiles, let's say, because to trace the emissions associated with the production of all of those pieces that then get assembled into an automobile, it's a nightmare.
So if we're gonna use AI for anything.
Yeah.
Oh, sure, and blockchain, there's a lot of talk about using
Externalities.
blockchain to track the emissions through the value chain. Yeah, so there are people working on it, and one of the topics that we discussed at this workshop in Rio is carbon accounting, and setting carbon intensity standards for sectors, so that we can use those to drive down emissions. But it does require some fairly careful accounting of issues, and it's technically challenging.
And will CO2 be the only marker from here on out?
Oh no, I mean, we're at the point where there's a broad recognition that it's not just CO2, it's all greenhouse gases, methane way up there amongst them. The expectation at this point is that countries, when they develop their targets, are looking at all greenhouse gases, not just CO2. So yes. I'm sorry, my job. Susan.
To piggyback on Alex, is anybody talking at your conferences about the impact of AI on the environment, what it takes to generate it?
My affiliation at Columbia University right now is with the Center on Global Energy Policy. And I have colleagues there who are looking closely at not just the impact of AI in terms of energy use, but also how it could be harnessed in ways to help more efficiently address some of these challenges. So it's definitely emerged as an area of focus. Happy to steer you toward their stuff.
But what about what it takes, the amount of energy?
Yeah, well, I think that you're seeing growing awareness about that. Now, that sector, right, the data industry, particularly here in the U.S., is highly attuned to climate concerns, and most of those companies, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, have made some pretty strong commitments to using only renewable energy. So they are amongst the largest buyers of renewable energy. Now, how well they're going to be able to do that with the huge increase in power need for AI, we'll see. But among industries, I would say they are about as committed as any to shifting energy to the right technologies. Yeah.
I heard Microsoft bought, or was thinking of buying, the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant.
Well, that's part of how they're going to provide the power for AI, yeah, which comes back to the earlier discussion about nuclear power.
I find that a little bit worrisome. Private companies are going to be owning these. Aren't most of them operated by or under the jurisdiction of the federal government?
Well, I mean, they're regulated by
Regulated,
the NRC and probably at the state level as well. I think most of them have always been privately owned and operated. The exception may be the Tennessee Valley Authority. I mean, it's pretty much been private enterprise all along. Highly regulated private enterprise.
I see. And then if a company wants to speed up something in this current administration, they can just perhaps buy some coin. That's not a question.
Yeah.
They were
I was just wondering, you spoke a lot about the creation of electricity, so I'm wondering if there's a hierarchy on the amount of energy used for specific things like energy or transportation, all those things. And then the other thing would be, is there any talk about population? I think the population since I've been alive is quadruple. So, with 8.8 billion people on Earth, do people talk about that at a policy level? I know it's probably
No. No. I mean, I remember years ago, back when China still had its one-child policy, there were people who were calculating how much they were helping to avoid emissions increase through that policy. But no, I mean, that's not some place where people generally go in policy discussions. That's kind of a third rail. As far as energy use, I mean, it's transportation and it's electricity. Those are the two major uses, and a lot of power either through electricity is supplied to industry or direct combustion in industry. And right now in the U.S., transportation is the largest source of emissions because we've transitioned a lot of the U.S. power supply away from coal to natural gas, so still fossil fuel, but much lower emitting fossil fuel, and renewables have expanded greatly, so the emissions profile of the power sector has improved. But part of the solution is electrifying other sectors, like we're seeing with transportation. Powering vehicles with electricity rather than with fossil fuels, which means a huge expansion in demand for electricity. And you'll want to do the same in lots of industrial sectors as well. So the real critical question there is, so where are we getting electricity from? So it's going to be, I'm sure fossil fuels will remain in the mix for a long time, but hopefully we can accelerate the transition away and to clean energy, and I do think you're going to continue hearing about nuclear. Yes.
Possession, what do you say to countries like Uganda, who have fairly recently discovered large reserves of oil, and of course they're very eager to start making money off it, but they've got to set up the entire industry, build it from the ground up, and of course that's exactly the wrong direction to be going in any greater plan, and they're getting a lot of pressure not to set it up. And of course, they're looking around to everybody else who made a ton of money off this for decades, centuries, etc. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, John Kerry used to talk a lot about meetings he had with, leaders in countries like that, who, would say, we'd love to, go the clean route, but who's going to help us make it affordable? We're not in a moral position to dictate to other countries how they use their natural resources, particularly when we've benefited all that we have from our use of fossil fuels. So I think that if we're going, it's gotten harder and harder, frankly, to finance that type of infrastructure. So it's very hard to get a World Bank loan these days to.
I think China will step in.
Well, possibly. So I think that we need to provide them with real opportunities to pursue alternative paths. And we've never done a good job of that. And it is not about government resources. We are never going to meet the need through Congress, for instance. It's really got to be about shifting private investment. So you need to provide the right set of incentives for finance to move in the right direction. And you know, I sometimes think that if private finance were just willing to accept a slightly lower return on investment, that would help. But that doesn't seem to be a concept that they're prepared to contemplate. John?
I'm interested in knowing what is our personal responsibility and can we make a difference?
Yeah. Well, I'll let all of you determine your personal responsibility. I think, you know, there are things you can do in your own lives to be more conscious of your energy use and use less of it or use different forms of it. You know, there are choices like the cars you buy, the appliances you buy in terms of their efficiency. You know, if you're in a position to put solar power on your house, that's certainly something you can do. You can choose not to fly. You can choose not to eat meat. So I think there are lots of things people you can screen your investments so that they're, you know, going to companies that are doing the right thing. So I do think there's lots that we as individuals can do to reduce our own sort of personal emissions profile. But I do think that ultimately what we need is structural change. And I don't think we're going to get there just by adding up all the personal choices about personal behaviors. We need the policies to drive the finance into the right development paths. So that brings us back to policy, which brings us back to getting the right people in office. Yeah, so that's something we can do. We have an online question.
Thank you. I've selected one comment from one of our 1,500 viewers. It is from Bill Gunter, who indicates that he's spent much of his life within forestry. And he would just like to highlight a quotation from Gus Speth, who is the former dean of the Yale School of Forestry. He says, "I used to think the top of environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems, but I was wrong." Let me continue. Here we go. I thought I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and a cultural transformation. And we, lawyers and scientists, don't know how to do that.
Is our county forester, retired county forester.
So I agree. Yeah, and you know, there are efforts within the faith community to help raise consciousness and mobilize action. You know, like I said earlier, I do think that we've made some progress in terms of raising consciousness. I think we've come a fair way there, but you know, what is it that's going to drive a spiritual awakening that would help mobilize us to address these issues? I'm going to you know, leave that for all of us to ponder.
How and why are the EU and New Zealand and perhaps others doing such a good job compared to us? And possibly in relation to that, has the WTO been a factor in holding some countries back from doing what they want to do?
Did you say how and why on
How and why?
So, I remember hearing a talk years ago, sort of contrasting the U.S. response with the EU response. And we place, we attach more importance to economic risk, for instance, and they're more willing to endure economic risk. The European Union, I mean, the very nature of that institution is about cooperative action. So they are more accustomed to operating that way. I think there are other sort of cultural and institutional differences. I mean, part of it obviously is the level of consciousness amongst the electorate that enables politicians to take actions that might entail near-term costs, but without being punished for it, right? So I'm afraid I can't speak to New Zealand in particular in terms of the circumstances there, but I think that you see at the moment the EU remaining more committed to alliances and multilateral institutions. So being more willing to think and act globally. We're very back and forth on these questions here in the U.S. As far as the WTO, what we're seeing now is that it isn't holding countries back. For instance, the U.S. With the Inflation Reduction Act, I think is a pretty clear case that the local content requirements that were included in the subsidies, that a certain portion of a vehicle needed to be made in the U.S. Are in direct violation of WTO rules. So we, for one, have been willing to ignore WTO restraints in taking actions that hopefully would help deliver on climate change. So I'm not sure that to date I think the WTO, well, frankly, the WTO has had a hard time delivering on much of anything for the last 20 years. But there were endless rounds of discussion about how to reduce tariffs on environmental goods and services. Basically make them cheaper for other countries to buy, which would help. But so far those negotiations have gone nowhere. So I think that in that sense, I can't say that it's WTO rules, it's the failure of WTO members to be willing to go there.
Not looking for an exact date here, but in terms of the temperature rise, keeping it 2 or 1.5, you said we're at what, 2.5 now?
No, last year I think we hit 1.5, but
Okay.
it could go down. Anyway, it's not like you hit it and you stay there.
Sure, it can fluctuate, right. And so what is the ideal, realistic number we're looking going for? Given the state of the world.
Yeah, well, I'm not an atmospheric scientist either, but the IEA projects at this point, based on policies now in place.
Yes.
This is a big if those policies are fully implemented, and if we do not enact any further policies, then we're on a path to 2.4 by 2100. Celsius, yeah.
Celsius.
Yeah.
And is that considered?
Which is obviously well above 2 and even further above 1.5. At this point, any realistic scenario for stabilizing at 1.5 would involve exceeding 1.5 for a period of time, and then an overshoot scenario and then hopefully reducing emissions sufficiently that the temperature would come back down to 1.5. Yeah, so.
Thank you for taking one more question from, this is your...
It's not a good theory.
No, we'll talk about that later. You know, you do have to mine uranium and it's carbon intensive. But anyway, I understand there's rockets going up every day now for satellites, and just more and more rockets going up to the through the upper atmosphere, releasing very potent blends of greenhouse gases, including black carbon. I've heard the term used. Can you comment on how space travel is accelerating climate change?
I hate to end on a note of ignorance, but I think of lots of reasons why I'm not excited about other people's excitement about space travel. You know, I probably should think more about the climate change implications of space travel. I'm not familiar with, on a sort of technical level, how much they're contributing and what the projections are for how much more they'll contribute. I mean, I don't know, I mean, if those emissions are above the atmosphere, then the impact will be moderated or minimal. But I don't know, you know, where those emissions are or what the trajectory is on them. So that's one to look into. So thank you all. I appreciate the questions. You know, it's great to be here in Guilford.
Thank you.